All right, is this on? Perfect. Okay. Great. I'll be talking about composability begins with a fast confirmation layer. So this is a talk about composability of Web3 applications. And sometimes when I get on stage and I give talks, I wish I had one of those clickers from like Men in Black where I erase your memory, because there's so much noise about composability, about interoperability. And so I want you to forget everything that you know about interoperability, and let's just go back to the basics. For Web3 applications to compose, they need to communicate. And low latency is key to enable real-time interactions. This equally applies to Web3 and Web2 interoperability. So for example, when Coinbase receives a deposit of ETH, Coinbase needs a message from Ethereum indicating that an ETH transfer completed, and a way to confirm the finality of this message, right? To avoid reversion and potential loss of funds. Speed matters, but so does integrity. Communication must be both fast and reliable. Now, of course, the reliability of a message can come from a variety of different sources or different assumptions. And so a key question is always, what constitutes a reasonable trust assumption when one application is verifying a message from another? And this may be different, or the minimum required assumption may be different when those two applications reside, for example, on the same chain versus different chains, or whether they are on the same, but they are on different L2s, but on the same L1, etc. And we'll get into that. How do you achieve trust minimization? So the key advantage of intra-chain messaging, meaning messaging between applications that reside on the same chain, is number one, that you can achieve zero latency, zero relative latency. Apps on the same chain, or in other words, virtual machine, communicate via function calls between smart contracts. An example would be an account on Ethereum depositing ETH into Uniswap, which then triggers an action in USDC's application, which triggers a transfer of USDC to the account. So single transactions trigger multiple app changes that all finalize at the same time, which is why they have this messaging has zero relative latency. The other aspect is that intra-chain messaging does not require any new trust assumptions beyond the assumptions that applications already make on those chains, or more precisely, that the users of those applications already make for those applications running on that chain, specifically the safety of the chain. The integrity, in fact, of the messaging between applications is ensured by VM logic. So even if the consensus fails, even if there's a reorg, the atomicity of messaging between the chains would still be preserved. There would be a perfectly intact version of message history on either fork. So the only problem is when the app, the social app behind Uniswap that users actually follow, and the social app behind USDC that users actually follow, were to choose different canonical forks in the event of a deep fork, say like Ethereum, like when Ethereum turned into Ethereum Classic and Ethereum, right? If that happened and Uniswap and USDC chose different forks, that would be a problem. But that is the only thing that can really break the integrity of intra-chain messaging. No new trust assumptions. Now, the challenge of interchain messaging comes from a variety of different places. First and foremost, communication between apps on different chains, like across L1s, requires each app to rely on some kind of new trust assumption. Example, an app on Ethereum reading a message from an app on Solana must trust Solana's finality. That is an additional assumption beyond the assumptions that application makes just by running on Ethereum. Another example. I look at exchanges as examples of chains. They're just centralized chains, right? And so when an exchange like Coinbase accepts a deposit from Ethereum, that is an example of a cross-chain messaging between Ethereum and the Coinbase system. Coinbase's system can't simply reorg its own state if an ETH deposit reverts due to a deep Ethereum reorg. For example, a user may have already traded for US dollars and cashed out using the legacy financial system. So this is the key challenge of interchain messaging, the introduction of some kind of new trust assumption. What about inter-rollup messaging, L2 to L2? Well, it is actually possible for rollups to communicate through the shared L1. For example, each rollup could have an outbox and an inbox. The sequencer of that rollup can fill the inbox with new messages from the outbox of the other rollup once those messages have been reflected in a finalized state of that rollup on the L1. So this inbox on rollup A would verify some kind of Merkle proof against the Merkle root of rollup B finalized on the L1. This is totally possible. It doesn't introduce new trust assumptions. It is similar to apps on the same chain communicating. However, even though apps across L2s on a shared L1 can communicate via the L1 without new trust assumptions, this has high latency for several reasons. First of all, infrequent checkpointing to the L1. Rollups do not post to the L1 all the time. They post infrequently to save on data publication costs. Or in the case of ZK rollups, to amortize the cost of ZK proofs. Furthermore, long settlement times for optimistic rollups. If optimistic rollups are settling up, via fraud-proof games, then there could be a long fraud-proof challenge window before the L1 actually reflects the finalized Merkle root of the L1. Now, this could be solved by fast off-chain ZK proofs for all rollup stacks, which is possible today using ZK VMs like SP1, RISC-0, Jolt that can compile any rollup stack. So going back to the previous slide, when inbox A verifies a message, it doesn't need to just read it from the L1. It can verify against some published data to the L1 that is finalized. The L1 doesn't have to have verified the execution of rollup B. It suffices for the inbox A to receive and verify a ZK proof that was computed off-chain and delivered directly to inbox A. This is completely possible, but it will still have a relatively high latency because of the long finalization times on chains like Ethereum. So it takes up to 15 minutes to even finalize just data that has been published. Even if you had a real-time proof, right, that was verified by the L1, the rollup state isn't final until after 15 minutes, because that's how long it takes Ethereum to finalize. Ethereum is a slow consensus protocol. Now, L2s have a superpower. Fast, soft finality. This is something very unique to L2 applications that is not exhibited by L1 applications. And this is due to the fact that only the sequencer is authorized to add new L2 transactions. The rollup sequencer collects transactions and periodically posts transaction batches to the layer 1 with a claimed state update. For validity rollups, the L1 would verify a validity proof. For optimistic rollups, it would enter a fraud-proof challenge window. Those details don't matter. But the point is that the L2 transactions also only depend on finalized Ethereum state. And while users can force include L2 transactions via the L1, they can only do so if the sequencer censors them for too long. So the sequencer, the L2 sequencer immediately knows that an L2 message is final, assuming the L1 is safe. I.e., something like Ethereum, that Ethereum never experiences deep reorgs that break final Ethereum blocks. As a result, wallets, applications on other chains, exchanges, etc., they can trust L2 sequencer confirmations of an L2 message if they trust both that the sequencer is honest and won't get hacked, and that the L1 is safe, that final L1 blocks never reorg. This is a superpower that is not possible for applications that run directly on the L1. There is no equivalent party to the sequencer that a wallet, app on another chain, exchange, etc. may trust for a fast confirmation. They have to wait the 15 minutes for the Ethereum L1 confirmation. So now obviously this introduces a new trust assumption, but if you trust the sequencer, you can get a fast confirmation. An example that I want to make sure is clear is not a real example. USDC's cross-chain transfer protocol does not trust sequencers today, but if they did, they could enable less than 1 second bridging of the USDC between different L2s. The way that CCTP works is that you can have a USDC contract on one chain receive an instruction from a USDC contract on a different chain that had burned a certain amount of USDC, and that is an instruction to mint the equivalent amount of USDC on the destination chain. If these messages just simply come from trusted sequencers, then within the span of a few seconds, you could bridge from USDC, from Optimism to Arbitrum to Polygon and back, etc. But sequencers can get hacked. A trusted sequencer can still get hacked. Temporary hacks of any sequencer, in the example I gave, can cause extreme damage to USDC. The hacker would be able to freely mint USDC on any of these chains, even if just one of the 3 sequencers gets hacked. Devastating hacks of centralized servers happen all the time in crypto. The Ronin Bridge, a $625 million loss. Harmony Horizon, Poly Network, Wintermute, Bitmart, most recently Bybit of $1.5 billion loss. These are not sequencers, but it doesn't matter. The concept is the same. All of these cases resulted from some form of compromising signing keys for a relatively small set of servers, enabling the attackers to maliciously authorize something. Hacks occur when there is money to be made. And centralized L2 sequencers are really no different. The risk for cross-chain apps, moreover, compounds when trusting centralized confirmations. Let's assume that each sequencer has a small independent chance of getting hacked, independent chance P of getting hacked. In our hypothetical running cross-chain transfer protocol example, the chance of USDC failure grows like n times P with n connected chains. So the risk of USDC getting compromised is now 100x higher if there are 100 chains in a cluster that are communicating. Because a single compromise of a single sequencer would allow for free minting of USDC on any of these chains. Now, contrast this to consensus protocols. If you use a consensus to protect sequencer reorgs, and I'll demonstrate in this diagram how this can be done by introducing a separate consensus protocol that is faster than the layer 1, a so-called layer 1.5. This is how it works. So the sequencer, before it posts to the L1, to the layer 1, it streams its transaction batches to this separate consensus protocol. An example of this that runs in production today is the Espresso Network, which can scale to thousands of validators like Ethereum. The sequencer streams its transaction batches and waits for a certificate from this consensus protocol before posting its batches to the layer 1. Note, the sequencer can still issue soft confirmations. Nothing has changed with regards to soft confirmations. The key difference, though, is that when the layer 1 bridge contract receives a state and receives a stream, a new batch of transactions for the L2, it checks not only that the sequencer has signed this batch, but that the sequencer has a certificate that this separate consensus protocol also signed off on this batch. What this prevents is that even if the sequencer gets hacked, the sequencer cannot post something else later to the L1 that is inconsistent with the batch of transactions that it streamed to the L1. So unlike soft confirmations, which can be violated when the sequencer gets hacked, confirmations that come from transaction batches posted to this separate layer 1.5 cannot be compromised unless the layer 1.5 is compromised. In our example, the USDC bridge, CCTP, could compute a message from transactions finalized on the layer 1.5. and have the protection of this consensus protocol instead of trusting individual sequencers. Wallets, apps on other chains, exchanges, etc. could confirm an L2 message against the Merkle root of the L1.5, similarly to the L2 superpower of sequencers, if they run a full node for the L2 to compute the message from transactions finalized by the L1.5, or they receive a proof they trust, like a zero-knowledge proof or even a trusted execution environment attestation verified against the Merkle root. If they trust that the L1.5 is safe, meaning final L1.5 blocks never reorg, and if they trust that the L1 is safe, final L1 blocks never reorg. It is a new trust assumption still, above the just trusting the L1 is safe, but it is a much, much weaker assumption than trusting centralized sequencers. And moreover, the risk, when many rollups share this, does not compound. So when you're trusting clusters of sequencers cross L2 apps like we described, they can be compromised if any sequencer is hacked. So the risk grows linearly with the cluster size. With trusting a shared consensus layer, like the L1 or the L1 plus Espresso Network, breaking the finality of any message from any chain requires compromising 33% of the validators running consensus, independent of the number of L2s that are using that consensus. The Espresso Network is a live confirmation layer that can be leveraged by L2s. It's been live on mainnet since November. It runs the HotShot consensus protocol, today on 100 distributed nodes, but transitioning to proof of stake in June 2025, which will turn this into a permissionless network that can theoretically scale to the size of Ethereum. I'll end with a joke trailer for my upcoming movie, because I advertised that this would be the first screening of this on Twitter. So for those of you coming here, I don't want you to think that I rugged you.
Then came the layer 2s in droves born out of them.
Oops. Try one more time.
In the beginning, there were only layer 1s. Then came the layer 2s in droves born out of a pressing need to scale. The layer 2 wars left the universe fragmented, disconnected. And then, in the 25th year of the third millennium in the 21st century, approximately 4.54 billion years after the Earth's formation, a new era began with the arrival of the layer 1.5. This marked a significant turning point in human history, the layer to unite them all.
So you can now generate trailers in under an hour using AI, which is pretty cool. Thank you, and that's my talk.